In this episode of the Overcame podcast, I'm joined by Pastor Brian Suter. Now, we are going to be diving into how do you find purpose? All of us are asking that same question. What is the meaning to my life? How do I know what I should truly be doing? And Brian's going to unpack some of that, and he's going to share purpose in his own life as to his calling towards ministry. So before we dive into this week's content, just want to share what's coming up in the next few weeks. We have Lewis Conway, formerly incarcerated to civil liberties strategist. Lewis was imprisoned for 30 years for murder. We have Shug Berry, inspiring women to live victoriously. And Dr. Raj is going to talk about overcoming childhood trauma. So all fantastic episodes. Now, as always, it would mean the world to me if you would like and share this podcast with your circle of influence. One of my goals is to grow and get these strong, powerful messages to further and really help and support more people. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Pastor Brian Suter on what I've titled, How to Find Purpose. Really excited today to welcome Pastor Brian Suter to the Overcame podcast. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Simon. It's so honoring to be here. I've been listening to your podcast, and you interview some of the coolest people. And I just hope that I can keep pace with them.
Well, and you're the pastor of my church. You'll be examining my every word as well, Brian. So I hope it goes well. But let's talk a little bit about who you are. So you are a pastor at Westwood Community Church. I mean, we have multiple pastors. We won't sort of name their roles, but you spent 16 years at Westwood. And those that people watching the video, they'll say you don't look old enough. So we'll have that. You know, you've got a BA in communication, your Master of Divinity, you're a husband, father of two, and like I said, you're one of the pastors at Westwood Community Church. So welcome to the show, Brian, firstly.
Thank you, Simon. Love what you're doing here. Have a ton of respect for you and what you're bringing, and just grateful. So thanks for having me.
Well, maybe we'll start with a little bit about, what do you do as a pastor at Westwood, Brian?
Yeah, so my role right now is the pastor of creative teaching content. And so that means that I get a chance to give messages or sermons on a regular basis, help kind of steer and help contribute to the direction of where those messages are going. And in addition to that, just a few other things that comprise of my role. But essentially the way that I would describe the role of a pastor is to just help guide people within a faith community towards the life that God has intended for us. And that's really, I think, what it's all about.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Brian, because part of what my podcast is about is the transformation and purpose. And I tell a lot of stories about you, and you might actually not realise, because one of the reasons I do a lot of things I do is that me and you randomly had a conversation one day when our children both went to the same daycare. And part of my background is in safety and security. And I said, who does the security at the church? And you connected me to Jim Tice, we become good friends, and I've now written 2 books. I've got 2 book businesses on church security. So you've really helped shape my direction and purpose indirectly. You might not even really sort of realise that.
Yeah, I think, we've had a couple conversations just about how you've come into what you're doing. But I didn't realize until right now that even that small conversation and that chance encounter created such a turning point for you. That's really, really cool to hear, because again, you're bringing so much that's important into this space for faith communities and what you're doing. And man, that I got to have a tiny part in that.
That's a big part. I've written 2 books, Brian, because that's a big part.
Yeah.
But so one of the things me and you met for a coffee a couple of months ago, and we're sort of talking about what a conversation might look like. And one of the things that I was really interested to learn about you is that the sort of journey to become a pastor. We talk about sort of purpose, or is it a calling? But maybe sort of share a bit about what was your journey to becoming a church pastor?
Yeah, to becoming a pastor, great question, Simon. I would say this, that becoming a pastor was not something that I found, rather it found me. In other words, I wasn't looking to become a pastor.
Yeah. And
that goes back all the way to my adolescence. When I thought about what I wanted to do, there were a lot of different definitions of that. I would say when I was 10 years old, I wanted to play professional sports, but I learned very quickly that I have a lot of other strengths than athleticism. But then when I got into high school and you start thinking about what are you going to do with your life, there were multiple different avenues that I considered at the beginning of that. And in the midst of that season of my life, I started to have this really amazing experience within the church that I grew up in youth ministry in high school.
Yeah.
And had such an incredible time in that, and felt like I was really alive when we were in those spaces, and watched a few people who were in the role of a professional youth pastor, so to speak, thought that might be something that I'd want to do. And then eventually over time, went to college and kind of had some stops and starts with other pursuits within the college space, and pretty quickly realized, I gotta pursue this. And again, it wasn't necessarily something that I was looking for, but, and I'm going to guess that maybe some people hearing this will have some similarities in their journey, but sometimes we hear what we're good at through other people.
Yes, absolutely.
And I heard from a couple other people, hey, you've got some gifts here that I think that you should pursue within ministry. And again, it was just a brand new file that opened for me. And I thought, okay, interesting. So then I went through school and served as a volunteer in a few youth ministries in the area that I grew up in. And then very quickly just felt like this was it for that season of my life. And then the journey to becoming it longer term just continued to unfold with every chapter, as I went from youth ministry to working in adult ministry into the now teaching and preaching role that I have within our church. It's been really amazing. And again, I think knowing that your podcast goes out to such a wide array of people, I believe that that's God that guides us. But I think the other thing that I believe is that I don't believe in random circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. Nor do I.
That there's an orchestration behind it. And so every chapter marker and season where something new unfolded was not by accident. And it found me, and it continues to find me every day. And I'm just grateful for it.
Yeah, and I think being a pastor, which is one of the reasons why it sort of fascinated me, and I was thinking, I've got to talk to Brian about this. It'll make an interesting story, is that being a pastor isn't really seen as being a job or a vocation. It's more of a sort of a way of life, because there's a belief behind it. So I guess, is there a time, or was there a time, Brian, where it moved into, okay, this is my purpose? I mean, was it when you got your degree from Bethel, or when you went through seminary and got your Master of Divinity? When did you feel that this was really my purpose in life, true purpose in life?
That's a great question, Simon. I would say there's a difference between knowing your purpose and owning your purpose. And I would say that as I went through the early portions of my career, 18 years ago when I was first getting started, I knew about this is probably my purpose for at least now. But as different dynamics kind of arose and unfolded within the journey, I would say there was a movement from knowing about it to owning it. And one of the things that I experienced, and this probably started 10 to 12 years ago, was, and this is one aspect of being a pastor, is helping families who are in a season of grief, and also helping families that are in a season of joy of weddings. And it was interesting. I feel like God used that experience of walking alongside of couples in weddings, and then also walking alongside of families when they've had loss at the highest level, to just know that this is my purpose, and I'm going to own it. And it's not of me. I'm just really a vessel. That's how I consider myself. But there was a dynamic to which walking alongside of a couple really specific situations where people had lost loved ones tragically made me realize this is what I'm made for. And there's a lot more that comes into different bullet points underneath that. But it was the crucible of walking alongside of people in some really sacred moments, life-changing moments where two people are standing in front of God and each other, saying vows to each other that make their lives come together as one.
Yeah.
But then also when there's loss of life, those are sacred moments that I get invited into to be a part of. And I'm really, really grateful for that sacredness. But then that was really a galvanizing moment for me to say, yeah, this is something I'm owning.
Yeah. And it's interesting, what was going through my mind, my next question was around sort of the difference between calling and purpose. And this podcast goes wider than sort of, those that have a faith or those that sort of believe, but everyone is searching for some type of purpose. I mean, is there anything that you've found in your life, either sort of spiritually or just through living life, as to you've seen for ways to try and help people understand, well, what is my purpose? And I, even through my friends, I get a lot of people say, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life, or what is it? What is my calling? What is my destiny? I mean, what have you When you look about it, when you hear about it as a pastor and as a father, I mean, what are things that people can do to try and find that purpose?
Yeah. Well, I think it was, and you can fact check me on this, Simon,
Okay,
but
I'll do that as well.
I think it was Mark Twain who said there's the two most important days of your life are the day that you're born, and then the second is the day that you discover why. And I think there's a dynamic for every single person where the journey of discovering why we are here is ever unfolding. I don't think we're ever fully done owning and standing in our purpose. I think there's different chapters and seasons to our why, to borrow from Simon Sinek, find your why.
Yep.
There's different chapters and seasons to what that may look like. But I think there's a couple different ways. There's something that's within every single one of us that we can't deny. When we think about it, our heart beats a little faster. There's something that stirs within our soul. So there's something within us that we need to unearth and listen to, kind of an inner voice, the inner voice of our soul to say, man, when I was doing that, I felt really alive. I think the second way to discover really what our purpose is and the why that we're here is through the voice of other trusted people. I had a mentor say to me that you want to find people that are for you and neutral about your circumstance. And what I mean by that is know you, know who you are, know your heart, know what you're about, but are not invested necessarily in the circumstance of how your why plays out. Who can say that is what you're made for, or I don't know about that piece right there. And then I think thirdly, it's trial and error and circumstance. So I learned pretty quickly on in college that I was not meant to be a mathematician because that wasn't the easiest thing for me to study and learn. And so that was a trial and error. So then I redirected and said, okay, I might have some gifts in communication. So I went to pursue that as a degree. And I found my purpose in communicating, in speaking. And I never would have had I not run into the brick wall of struggling with certain pieces of math. So that's one example of try and error. But again, I think it's what's within us. I think it's what are people around us who are for us and neutral about circumstances saying, and then trial and error, bottom line. And again, if we're not dead, we're not done.
Yeah,
and I think there's a lot of different dimensions of our purpose that unfolds every single day, every single month, every single year that goes and coincides with our seasons. And I think, Simon, you just mentioned something too about being a father. I don't necessarily believe that my purpose changed when I became a dad, but the profound nature of my purpose shifted. There was something different in the fabric that now my wife, Courtney, and I are now responsible for two lives, two eternal beings that God has invited us to help shape. And that is important. So for me, it's my faith, it's my family, and then it's everything else, vocation in church, etc., whatever that might be. So.
Yeah, interesting, because I was talking to a pastor, I think I've got to have something biblical in here somewhere. And I was hunting down a scripture and I actually found one in Proverbs 29:18, which says, where there is no vision, the people perish.
Yeah.
And I think it is when I talk to friends, and there is sort of ambiguity with their life, quite often it's, well, what is your goal? What is your plan? People close to me will know that I'm very rarely do I sleep 5 or 6 hours a day. I've always got something going on. And say, well, how do you do that? I'm like, well, how do you not? And it's having, what's your plan? What's your goal? Those things help you find your purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great, yeah. Well, Brian, one of the things, because I've got a pastor, and my pastor who's a friend that I know as well, I hear a lot of things about the responsibility and the depth that comes with being a pastor. And I know Craig Crescero, who I listened to his leadership podcast from One Life, Life Church.
Yeah.
So one of his biggest challenges as a pastor is envy. I got to know Frank Pomeroy, who's the pastor of Sutherland Springs Church, First Baptist down there. Sadly, they had that mass shooting where his daughter was killed, and he said one of the things that challenges him is that when he can be having an off day as a pastor, that people still expect things of him. His daughter's died, but people are still coming to him saying, my wife just left me, can you help? So there's challenges there. So I guess you as a pastor, what do you find being most challenged about the role?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I haven't had
it's a tough
time
one
to
as well.
think about that.
You haven't. Yeah, you're getting you off the cuff here, Brian.
Yeah, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that there's challenges in every role that people have. And I think the challenges that we have feel really weighty because we know them, but I don't know someone else's challenges the same way that Like, for instance, I don't know your challenges the same way that I know mine, but everybody has their own unique set of circumstances that are challenging. The way that I would probably answer that question, Simon, is just the weight of what we do, which is to help people to encounter God and to know that this God has come that they might have a life to the full, a life that they were created for, and to know that I can do the best job that I can in whatever it is that I'm doing, whether I'm having a conversation, whether it is that I'm giving a message within church. And the challenge is I have no control over the results. Zero. Yeah. Because if someone receives that message and puts their belief in Jesus, that's God's work, but it's also their choice. And what's really hard about that is to not get lost in what I'm viewing as the lack of a result, but see the bigger picture of how God is weaving something in my belief system, how God is weaving something that I can't see, I have to trust, and I will know in the rearview mirror as I look back. So it's probably the gap between what I do versus how much control I have over it, of the result being there. And as I've gotten older, with age comes wisdom, right? Yeah. I would say I've gotten a little bit better at reconciling that gap and being okay if I don't necessarily see the results that I want, because I know that there's someone orchestrating some things behind the scene that, again, I just don't have any control over. So I might have a different answer for you later on this afternoon, but I think that's what first comes to mind.
Well, we can always go back and re-record and try and find it in. But I guess one of the things, as you were just talking then, a good friend who used to work for me, a bit older than me, a good friend called Dennis, he said to me, something's happening in my life at work, and he said, Simon, you're not in control, and you're not supposed to be.
Yeah.
And Dennis has moved down to Florida, and we sort of still talk on the phone, and he reminded me a couple of weeks ago of that, saying, Simon, you're not in control, nor are you meant to be. And I mean, sometimes, I threw that question to you just because I'd heard other pastors talk about what most challenges them, but I think it is that sort of internal processing that we're not in control, nor we're supposed to be. We can just try and guide and orchestrate as best as possible, but there's many things outside of our control.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And whatever result it might be, whether it's someone that I know that is facing a difficult circumstance that I have no control over, or people within our congregation, whatever it is, marriages, families, etc. It's just we don't have a whole lot of control over those components. We can just do the best job that we can to help people to see God's intention, and for me personally to see God's intention for my life and their life, and for them to pursue that.
Yeah. And let's move on to something a bit different then, Brian. So what about life experiences that have shaped you? I know when I heard you preach before, and you've sort of told me during a coffee about, I think, was it your grandfather? Yeah. So maybe share a bit about, how that shaped your life.
Yeah. Thanks, Simon. I from a very early age, my grandfather was someone who really kind of took a special interest in me, in investment. And I was the only boy in his bloodline, and I have two sisters, and they were special to him too. But there was just something unique. So my grandpa Bill was a World War II fighter pilot. He flew a P-47 in World War II, and was just an aviation nut. And he made a really deep and lasting impact in me in that space, because what he would do is he would take me to air shows, and we would go and build model airplanes together. We would spend time. I just have vivid memories, back in the day where you didn't need an airplane ticket to go down the concourse.
Yeah.
Because he was who he was able to talk to a gate agent, and we went and sat in the cockpit of a brand new plane that had never been flown before that was sitting at the gate. And so there's just these dimensions that are a part of that for me. So he invested in me. He came to all my sports. And then one of the other things that he did that made an impact, and why I often talk of him as it relates to my faith, is that in the midst of all that, here he is, this larger than life hero to me. He lived this quiet, steady, persistent, and honest faith journey. He was involved in churches. He led choirs. He built massive pipe organs and played them just by ear. He'd never had any formal training. And then one of the things throughout my life that I experienced was my maternal grandmother, his wife passed away when I was 5 years old. And as a young kid, that was my first experience with anyone dying in my life. And I was impacted by that because I had had my eyes fixed on him and how he did that journey. And he was real and honest. And I've learned things about how honest he was about his faith in that time since he's passed away over, well over, gosh, what is it, 15 years ago now. But he modeled an authentic faith for me that didn't just try to like push through problems or hardship or pain, but genuinely encountered a living God in the midst of his loss. That was really huge and important. So watching him kind of set me on this trajectory, and being involved in church set me on a trajectory to become ultimately who I am in my faith, most importantly, but then also what I do. So that's one thing that definitely shaped me.
Yeah, I mean, what I like about that story, every time I hear you talk about your grandfather, I get a different sort of nugget in there. But it's really about, he was very purposeful in the relationship. And I think, as I sort of focus on, purpose, transformation and leadership, we all need to look for someone that we can look up to, that can guide us, and also someone that we can bring alongside us and share the knowledge. And most people know part of my personal journey, but I didn't have a father figure in my life. But I look back now, and even as a young sort of boy, I could have been thinking, well, where can I seek out that relationship? And it's not something that you really get now because you're too young at that time to really see that. But I think hindsight's allowed me to look at it and think, where can I have found those relationships? Because it's really important. I think we're going to sort of go off into a different direction, but I think it's one of those things which is really missing in our society today, is having those positive role models. It seems that your grandfather was a real strong sort of figure for you in that way.
Yeah, he was very significant, and really both my grandfathers were, and my dad and my mom and so many other people that invested into me, and I'm grateful for every one of their impacts in my life.
Yeah. And so what types of challenges have you sort of had to overcome then, Brian, that might have sort of shaped your purpose and direction? I mean, even just going through sort of seminary or just growing up, what challenges have you had to overcome which have helped shape who you are now today?
Yeah, man, that's a good question. I think about some of the guests that you've had on this podcast, and sometimes I feel like my challenge is pale in comparison to some of the things that they've walked through. And honestly, it's so meaningful to hear them talk about some of those components and how it has formed and shaped who they become.
Yeah.
I would say one of the challenges that has helped to shape me has been running. Maybe one example is running into conflicts with other people in whatever context that we have. Conflict can be a great mechanism and a great crucible to create something that is better than was before. And when we run into conflict, obviously we see something differently than somebody else does. And depending on what the meaning of the conflict is, it can be much more difficult than others. But when we walk through conflicts, there's something that I believe can be shaped in that. And I've had, a series of them. We all have, right? We all experience conflicts. This world isn't perfect, and no relationships are perfect. Yeah. And whether they're in our home or whether they're in our church or whether they're in our business or workplace, it's there. But my question that I often have to work hard at is, what can I learn about myself and how I can grow in the midst of this conflict that I'm facing with someone else? And one of the things that I try to practice is, if I get a note of critique, for instance, like in my messages, sometimes I get critiques.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You do get emails on that?
Yeah, I do. And when I was younger, I just kind of but it is, let me say this, it is interesting. You can hear a dozen kind, affirming compliments, but your mind fixates on the one that was the opposite. And what I've learned to do over time, because of not handling it well, is I've learned to say there's a nugget of truth in what I'm hearing that I don't want to hear, that I have to hear. There's a nugget of truth that I need to hear in what I'm hearing that I don't want to, but I have to. And I'll keep a file folder of those kind of comments and just say, okay, I can grow. For instance, I'll be real specific. I got this note from someone who was really bothered by the way that I smacked my lips when I spoke. And
I need to talk to my wife. She said, well, my wife Courtney says that all the time.
Yeah. And so I said, I didn't know I smacked my lips. But first, I got resistant. I'm like, I don't smack my lips. Did you miss the rest of the message? But then I thought, okay, slow down. What is there to learn from me in that? And I went back and listened to the message that this person critiqued me for. And sure enough, I smacked my lips. And so every time I get up, Simon, I think about that. I'm thinking about it right now as I'm speaking into this microphone. So that's one challenge that I've encountered. And I think everybody has. I hope everyone can relate to that. But then again, I would go back and just say one of the other challenges is, again, the gap between what I can do and what I can actually control, between what people do or choose or what they want to become. So,
and that sort of self-reflection, you might call it, Brian, is that something that you've learned or just developed in the role? That's really what I hear. There's a lot of self-reflection in there and accountability against yourself, which we sometimes in life we tend to push that away. And like you said, no, it's not me. But you seem to sort of develop quite a lot of self-reflection. Do you think that was the role of a pastor, always being on display, always sort of having this sort of stature? What caused you to really be able to internalize those type of comments?
Yeah, well, I'll say this, it's not easy. Every time that there's a comment like that, there's always a resistance in me that matches that first. But through other mentors that I've had in my life, through, I think the best person to speak in our life is the one who's closest to us. So through my wife, and then through friends, I've just learned to just be open to those things. And again, it doesn't mean that I'm perfect at it, because I have still a long way to go. But I've also realized that if I don't listen to that, then I'm going to run into some trouble along the way. If I'm not checking my pride, even if I'm not being open to whatever it is that I can learn from that, I won't get better. And it's just a reminder that I try to carry with me every time I face challenges like that.
Well, another tough, challenging question for you, perhaps.
Sure.
Brian. I should say for Brian, normally I give my guests a bit of a heads up as to where we're going, but for whatever reason, for you, Brian, it was zero heads up. It's like, you're all had at this. Let's go.
Yeah.
But is there a moment in your life when you feel that everything perhaps clicked? And this might not have happened as yet, but is there a time when you felt that you are content, you do understand your purpose, you do know why adverse things might have happened in your life? Is there any memory that comes where you say, this is where I understood what it was about to be a man, a father, or be in the workplace, whatever it might be for you?
Yeah. Great question, Simon. Thanks for giving me a heads up on that.
Well, exactly.
The way that I view that is, again, through the concentric circles of importance around my life. And I think as it relates to my faith journey, the major one for me was really when it all kind of came together. And that was at a summer camp in high school. And I just really sensed God saying to me, I have life for you if you'll be open to it. And I let that life in and said yes to this God, Christ, who's leading me into this moment and then wants to lead me through the rest of my life. So that's really when it clicked for me. I'd say just on the outside of being, a husband and a father, that's one for me that still continues to click every day in a new way. But it's interesting. Sometimes our kids will write things about us for school. You've probably seen this with your two boys,
yes,
but they'll
absolutely.
bring home projects like, my dad, I wish I could remember it because it's hilarious, but they'll bring home this sheet. Like, my dad weighs 250 pounds and he eats a lot of pizza and he likes to play sports with me, etc. And one of the things that is on those sheets is like my dad or my mom shows me love by, and every time that they've written an answer in that blank, it's some simple things. But the common thread with all those simple things is I've taken everything else away and I've just fixed my eyes on them. And I've said, whatever they're doing, I'm doing, whether it's building Legos or being in the yard, throwing the football back and forth, going to a game or helping coach their sports, if my eyes are on them, I just think everything else snaps into place. But I've got to put phones away. I've got to mentally sift through the day that I've had enough to be fully present with them. And again, I do that some days well, and there's other days that I don't do that very well. But if my eyes are fixed on them, then it's all really clicking. And then I would say, just in terms of my work, it's more along the lines of just watching. Here's where it clicks for me, and this is something that I will always be overwhelmed by. When someone's life changes before my eyes, I remember God is the one who does that, and I just get to play a really small part in it. But that's why I'm here, for people to know that Jesus came to bring them a life that's described by him in the scriptures as a life to the full, and then to watch them live in that life and watch their lives change. That's amazing.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned about the kids, and I'm the same. I think the last time my son brought something home, I was 72 years old or something on one of those little things. But it's,
72.
It was, yeah. I was like, where did he even get that from? Maybe not even the right numbers in different order. But I really take a lot from it, because it's a battle that I have, is to always try to be in the moment. It's something that I'm going to always struggle with, but I know it is incredibly important, because it is those memories. And we've only had a short time together, Brian, but you've given 4 or 5 strong nuggets in there that I know people are going to really sort of draw close to, go away, do some more reading, some more understanding and self-reflection on. So it's been great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me here, Simon. It's always fun to hang with you. And again, just really respect what you're doing, and I'm grateful as a pastor in a church for what you're creating with Kingswood and beyond, and then what you're allowing to happen in this space with the podcast. It's a gift to so many. I'm grateful for you and what you're doing, and that I got a chance to be a part of it today.
Thank you for joining us for the Who I Became podcast. If you are enjoying the discussions between Simon and his guests, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review, as well as share with your friends on social media. Once again, thank you for joining the Who I Became podcast.